So, everyone, this is Gareth Slightham, who is, well, I'll let him tell you exactly what he is and what he does. Here, will you just turn the lights out, please? Thanks. That's it, Gareth. The floor is yours.
All right, okay. So, I don't know, what do you want to know? I'm an illustrator and concept artist and comic book artist based in Hull. I do other projects as well that tend to be, I suppose, unusual projects that don't necessarily fit into a kind of like a pigeonhole. So like weird stuff. I've done stuff like designing logos for medical robots and stuff like that to give them a sort of like, you know, an identity and things, and virtual reality design for testing theatre production with early parts of technology and things like that. So a whole bunch of things. I've been a theme park designer in the past, an archaeological illustrator, and I've designed exhibition stands, visitor attractions, museums, that sort of thing. But right now I'm concentrating on concept art, comic books, and just illustration that I enjoy. Pretty niche, sort of like, I suppose, tabletop role-playing game sort of like art, that sort of thing.
So is it a good job, Gareth? Is it lucrative? Is it rewarding?
It can be, depending on where you want to go and what you want to do with stuff. I mean, I've had, like I say, various different jobs over you know, working for other people and working freelance, and at different periods in time, it's been very lucrative. In other times, it's been not so lucrative, but it's been great. Sometimes there's no real correlation, depending on, I suppose it depends on who you are, between the job being highly lucrative and the personal satisfaction you get from the work.
Okay, so how do you promote yourself? How do people find out how to hire Gareth?
Right, I suppose various different things. So I'm pretty active on social media. I'm on Twitter a fair amount. I have a YouTube channel. I have a Facebook group page dedicated to just my artwork. Over the years, I've had a number of different blogs, some that I've used with my students, some that I've just used as self-promotion, and some which have been a mixture of the two, I suppose. And you know, if there's a new social media outlet or a sort of like an arts social media outlet, so something like ArtStation is fantastic, because it's like a portfolio and an advertising space. Plus they advertise jobs within the industry on that page as well. So, and you've got people who are not necessarily artists looking at ArtStation and trawling through it and looking for artists constantly. So,
if there's such a thing, what is an average day for you?
Again, it depends. I mean, I'll get up maybe around 7:45, and now that I use my iPad quite a lot, this is my studio here, really, which is my living room. But I do have two small studio spaces as well, depending on the kind of work I'm doing. But a lot of my work at the moment is digital. So I can quite happily just sit in my studio and I'll work through the day, then I'll go get some lunch and I'll work into the evening. I'll take some time and spend some time with my family around tea time. And then in the evening, I'll be sitting with my wife in the room while she's doing what, you know, she needs to be doing. And I can continue working until quite late. And so I'll probably knock off and put the pen on the top of the iPad sometime around 11:30 maybe. And that's just if I've got a job on and I'm trying to get that job out the door. But yesterday, for example, I had a meeting, so I had to go out and I had to go visit a site. I had to take some measurements. I had to look at the kind of like the way that light disturbed the site, because we were building a set for a theatre performance, and kind of make all those kind of decisions and chat with the clients about what they wanted, how much work they wanted, and to what level they wanted me to take the work.
When you're not using your iPad, then what are the tools of the trade? What's in your studios?
Well, I do some 3D stuff. So I'll build models if it's complex. Say if it's something that's going to be built in 3D in the real world, I'll build card models for myself. But I also use digital 3D tools, whether that's SketchUp or something like It's one of there's several apps that I use sort of like on the iPad that can be used for 3D digital work. In terms of sort of like traditional sort of like pens and pencils, you've probably this sort of thing before. He's trying to get it on camera there. So like a propelling pencil, because it just saves all the mess of sort of like having to bother sharpening things. I use a 0.5 propelling pencil. I don't particularly buy really expensive ones. I have a number of them on the go with maybe different leads in, and maybe even a blue lead one for sketching in and then inking over if I'm going to do some inking work. Uni Pen Pins are brilliant, come in all different sizes from 0.1s right up to 0.8. I tend to have a 0.3 on the go and a 0.8 for the different thicknesses of drawing that I'm doing, a 0.3 for sketching, 0.8 for outlining. And then these, which are just fantastic, especially for your comic book artist, and you're trying to get that different line weight in your work, or you're trying to add some sort of like real kind of personality to your sketching, and that's a brush pen. And I don't know if you can see that there, but it's like a proper brush with like ink cartridges that are replaceable. So that can, so long as you look after the tip of that, it will pretty much last you for good. Those things are about £9 really to buy, and you get 2 free ink things with them. Over the years, I've used various different solid pens and pencils and tools. But I'll paint in acrylics, I'll paint in oils, and I'll paint in watercolours as well. So it just depends what the job demands. Okay.
There's a number of student questions as well.
Oh yeah, cool.
So they've asked me to ask them. They've sent, some of them have sent some for me. So what or who inspires you?
Right. Okay. Well, that list is pretty long, to be fair. In terms of the different types of work that I've done, over the years, I've looked at a lot of great, there's a lot of great concept artists out there. People like Sparth, Carl Kapinski is a great character designer. Ian McHugh is great. I tend to look a lot to the past as well. So I'm not shy about sort of like wearing my influences on my sleeve in terms of sort of like the old art stuff. So on my shelf over there, I've got books by, you know, on Rembrandt, Singer Sargent, Gustav Doré for pen and line work. I mean, if you want to learn to paint figures and faces, you can't go wrong looking at people like Singer Sargent, because they were quick, and they just really could capture light and shape and form just using that sort of thing. And they're kind of the precursors of modern concept art. If you were to look at sort of like great games designers who were designing characters at the concept level, not necessarily taking them through to 3D. If you look at games designers, people like that, you'll see that they will probably have those kind of books on their shelves as well. In terms of comics, I'm a huge fan of Mike Mignola, who draws Hellboy. His use of, you know, black and light in his work is just off the charts. So.
Okay, what piece of work that you've created are you proudest of?
Probably the one before last. Every time. Because the last one, you're always worrying about it, and it sometimes feels like it's not up to scratch because you're still living in it. The previous one before that is the one where you've built upon all of the other work that you've done to that moment. And the stuff that goes further and further back, you're kind of wanting to abandon it because it's old and it's got loads and loads of flaws in it. So I'd say, for me, it's always the one before last.
Someone's just fired a question at me for you from one of the other rooms. And he wants to know, how do you know your characters that you design and your concepts you design are unique and original?
I think it comes down to everybody's work is a kind of a mashup of themselves. And, you know, I've been asked this by other students before, and they're saying, how do I make my work, you know, my own and my own style? And you've got to try and not worry about what other people are necessarily doing. And you've got to try and, definitely one of the things you shouldn't do is push all of the work away and not look at other people's work. You need to know what's going on. You need to know kind of the directions and trends that people are taking. if only to go in a different direction, you know, or to go in that direction. If an art director tells you we want something in the style of, and you say who, they're going to be worried that you don't keep up with understanding sort of like what kind of artwork's been produced by people. So you need to look at other people's artwork. You need to know about art trends and everything else. But for me, I tend not to worry about whether my work's unique or not, and I tend to try and experience as many new unique things as I can. So you get out into the world, you look at stuff that's happening, you see events and things, and you draw those down. If you travel to somewhere and you find a unique building and you make a sketch note of it, that will be fairly unique to you. There might have been, you know, 100 other people that over time have been there and drawn that building or that rooftop. But if you go on Google and just type in that particular type of rooftop, the first 3 or 4 pages will have been looked at by thousands of other designers. So the way to find uniqueness in your own work is to experience unique things. Don't worry about what anybody else is listening to in terms of music. Listen to your own music. Listen to, you know, watch different TV shows, experience different books, read a range of different sort of like books and a range of different comics. Don't just necessarily pigeonhole yourself in one thing. Even if you are certain that you are going to go down one path and say, for example, you're going to draw horror comics and that's it. You need to be looking at stuff outside of horror comics, you know, to make your work that much more unique. And because everything that you make is, it's basically you put loads into the machine and then the creativity comes out.
One of the things that I'm interested in when I've been talking to the various artists and designers we've spoke to, do you do warm-up work or do you go straight into a project? Do you do warm-up tasks or little exercises yourself? You just talked about little sketches you might do.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, if you're going to be doing a lot of inking that day and it's pretty detailed work, you sometimes don't want to go in cold. So yeah, I'll take an hour or something to just do some of my own work. You know, if I'm doing something that's very figurative, I'll maybe just thrash out a few figures and stuff like that and have a bit of a play. And then you kind of like, you're in the mindset. And when you swap it into the project, you're kind of ready to go. You don't kind of go, right, I'm going to set 45 minutes for a warm up necessarily. It's more of a kind of a natural process. People who do lettering and, you know, non-digital lettering tend to, you know, used to write the alphabet out like 3 or 4 times before they started the actual work and things like that. And it's natural for, I suppose, sports people and everything to do those kind of things as well. This isn't about muscle work as such. It's more about mind to muscle work. It's building up and refreshing that muscle memory before you go in and do something, I suppose. But yeah, I do. And a big project, obviously, is just full of warm-up work, which is just all the sketches and the thumbnails and everything else that has to come before. And you'll pop out of a project as well, because you'll be working on something and it is just not working. And everybody has days like that. And so you'll have to stop what you're doing, step out of that, and then just thrash out a few designs and sketches and everything until you can get it right, and then take that back into the project.
What would you say is easiest? Is it easier to look at a piece of your work and go, wow, that's fantastic, we're going to stick with that one? Or is it easier or harder to look at a piece of work and go, no, I can't send that, there's something wrong with it, I'm not sure what it is, but I've got to do it again? It's not easy admitting to the flaws in your work, but you have to be kind of brutal sometimes and really do that. At a professional level, you're not just measuring yourself against yourself, you're measuring yourself against the work of others. That doesn't mean to say that you can't embrace failure, you just have to do it at the right time. Milton Glaser, the graphic designer, put it far better than I could ever do it. And he says, your life as a designer or creative person and a visual creative person is kind of divided into 2. The professional side of you and the professional development and the personal development. On the professional development side, you are asked to do more and more
of less and less in a very focused, narrow channel of the things that they think that you are good at, because you have done that more and more in your professional life. But if you want to get better and you want to avoid boredom, you have to, in your personal development time, try new things and new techniques. And by trying new things and new techniques, you will fail over and over again, but you will get better and better. And those things that you do in your personal development time can be added into your professional, broadening that, making it less likely you're going to get bored with your own work over time. But yeah, Milton Glaser was right on it. He really understood the kind of whole process.
How easy is it to actually say, once you've finished your education in your college and your university or whatever, how easy is it to actually say, yes, I'm going to go and do freelance illustration and artwork every day, and be aware that some days I'll be hungry and some days I'll be loaded? And is it tempting to maybe go for a more mundane job, perhaps, just to make sure the bills are paid?
I suppose the classic example of that is actors in Hollywood, isn't it? That work at gas stations while they're working on their scripts, or, you know, and sort of like people who are writing novels while they're driving a cab and stuff like that. There's, at some point, you're going to have to make the jump and jump in and maybe go full time. And it might not just happen once. It might happen a number of different times. I started out when I left university taking on a number of little freelance jobs. And it wasn't, at that time, because my work, was still fairly naive and I didn't know myself well enough to treat the work as professionally as I probably could have. I had to sit back and think about a job. And unfortunately for me, a job did come along, a weird one, but I went for it anyway. And I learned a lot of stuff in a studio environment where I was a junior and worked my way up to a lead designer. That company then just fell away from underneath me, redundancy, lots of different reasons for that to happen. And so I was freelance again, but because then I had a number of different clients within the market that I was working in, which was theme park design and visitor attractions and museums, they came straight to me because they knew of my work through this other company and the other companies, and I had traction and I could do lots and lots of work. Then a little while later, and this was one of the strangest things, is it was about 5 to 6 months after 9/11. And all of the work just dried up across Europe and in the UK that I was working on, because the financial markets at some point had just tightened their grip on everything. Budgets were tight for everybody, and it took a little while for that to trickle back down. And then suddenly there was no work. So I had to take another job with another design company that I'd been kind of handing off for a little while. They'd been asking me to go work for them, and I'd been, no, I quite like freelance. I'd gone down and worked with them as a freelance for a little while. But then because all of the other stuff dried up, I took that job. So for a little while longer, I worked with those guys. And then I moved back up north about half a decade later, and again started to try and build that kind of work up again. And recently, leaving teaching and deciding that's it, I'm going to go back and I'm going to do the things that I love for a little while, and got back into comics. And again, just built up a little bit of traction through social media, through hanging out with other people that do similar things, through getting out into the community and joining some of the community groups that are out there, both online and by going to the conventions and meeting people. You kind of build up that traction again. And it gets easier as you get more experience. And that experience doesn't have to be a 30-year experience. You can do that in quite short amounts of time, particularly now, I think, because of the sheer advantage of having the internet and, you know, social media and being able to get your work out and in front of people. Art directors and people like that are constantly trawling, you know, social media sites, Instagram and everything, looking for people. And if you put yourself out there and you put your work out there, at some point somebody's going to pick up on that and hopefully give you the break that you need to get out there. It takes some dedication to do it, you know, and you have to be willing to take the knocks and sort of like, and take advice as well. That's one of the biggest things, is It's just learning to take advice, not begrudgingly. Because quite often, you know, there are always going to be people that are just unpleasant, you know, and they're unpleasant for the sake of it sometimes, and they're in a position where they can be awful to you about your work. But you should at a certain point be able to tell the difference between those people and the people that are really trying to help you improve your work. And they will give you great advice, and they will knock you into shape, and you will use that advice to knock yourself into shape as well. So
yeah, I had a message from Holly, who was a student in another room during that, and she asked how you got into things after your education. So I hope that answered the question. If it didn't, Holly, you'll message me again and we'll find out. Something you said to me once, I don't know if it was when we were chatting at a Comic-Con or when I was interviewing you at one, but it was an interesting thing you said, and it might, I'll tell you what, it might have actually been on Awesome Comics podcast. You once said about using computer technology and computer programs, that it was important that you made the program work for you, not the other way around. And I always thought that was an interesting quote. So could you share that with the students, please?
The designers of most software base their decisions on what they put into the software on information from people that are users. But every user is unique, and they can't satisfy necessarily everyone. And so the software will often try and steer you in a direction to do things the way that it needs to be done for the software to handle it the most effectively. That said, there's nothing to stop you using a piece of software to a halfway point, then screenshotting it, printing it, photographing it blurrily with your phone, and then transferring that into another piece of software, or printing it out and then printing it out on acetate and sliding it around over the top of another acetate version of it, and then copying it from what you've got from that onto a large canvas. You need to use the tools in the way that you want to use them to get the job done. At the point where the software starts dictating to you how creative you can be, you're becoming a technician for that piece of software to produce things that it's clearly, obviously capable of. And when you're asked questions about how do you make your work unique, it's by sort of like not being satisfied with the standard operating procedures of digital software or the pens and stuff that you have. I mean, all of us that have done traditional work over the years have always taken we've all taken toothbrushes and dipped them in ink and then flicked your thumb across them to splash sort of like paint across. A toothbrush is not designed for that, but it's a great tool when you're sort of like finishing up some sort of traditional work and stuff like that. And anything that you can bend, break it, take a piece of bamboo and sort of like so it's got all of the kind of ragged edges on it and paint with that, painting with the side of a piece of cardboard or something like that. All of the traditional stuff, it seems that you're very expected to bend and break it to your creative will. But software can be just the same. You can use as much of it or as little of it as you want. And just because there's something in the software doesn't necessarily mean you have to use it or it will make your work better. I mean, every piece of art software that you can find, whether it's Procreate, Photoshop or whatever, has hundreds of brushes in it. Do you know what I mean? And then customizable brushes. And it's great. Make your own custom brushes, learn how to do that. Those things can be great and very unique to you. But I can tell you now that if any of the people there have looked at some of the paintings that I've done, the digital paintings and stuff like that, I use 2 brushes in Procreate. I use a single technical pen brush in Procreate, and I use the flat painting brush. And I rarely touch anything else, very rarely. You don't need it. And people like things from FZD and stuff like that, he'll tell you exactly the same thing. Is that, the brushes and stuff are great and they can be really useful for certain processes and things like that. But you don't need it. The brushes aren't going to save you. The technical parts of the software aren't going to save you. It's what you bring to it. It's just another tool.
Yeah, great advice. That sounds like quite a good moment where you've been talking about some of your own work. Have you got some stuff to show us today, Gareth?
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, I've got some little bits and pieces. How do you want to do it? Do you want me to just show you a demo, or do you want to have a look at anything in particular? Is there any kind of work that you wanted to look at?
Any way you'd like to do it, Gareth. It might be nice to see a couple of bits of your work, maybe, and then if you can show them something on the screen, might be brilliant as well.
Right.
I think
we talked about
your
time,
time
and stuff like that as well. So,
yes.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, I guess, now is I'm going to try and share my screen so we can see what's going on there. But you can see my screen as it is, can't you? So if I flick that up, can you see my screen now?
We can just see your name at the moment. We can't see
my name.
Yeah, we haven't got the visual link anymore.
All right, okay, that's interesting. Right, I'll try and get back on that then. That's right. Okay, so I wonder why that's not worked. Normally, I would be able to show my screen. So,
classic
right.
Zoom meeting technical hitches.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just going to try and do that participants. Screen. Okay.
Still not seeing it. It might.
There you go. It should be starting. You got it, yeah?
Yeah, we can see you now.
All right, cool.
Okay,
cool. Let's get up on the screen. So, suppose one of the things that we could look at is so on my ArtStation, there's various types of work kind of going right back. So you can see various sort of like stuff that I do. So 3D stuff, sort of like sculpting in 3D for character stuff. And that's actually thinking about an actual piece of work that I wanted to take to a more physical level by, maybe turning it into an actual statuette. I've got some other kind of like card stuff on there. So this was kind of like concept art stuff that I would eventually maybe take into a piece of software like Procreate or Photoshop and then do a paint over of it. And you can see that with this next one where I've done like a kit bash. I took an old plastic toy from a pound shop or something like that, and I wanted to make this kind of flying taxi cab. So I've just used double-sided tape and paper and kind of pasted over the original model. And then eventually sort of like did some quick shots of it, played around with sort of like lights underneath it and stuff like that to see if that would work, and eventually kind of produce like a concept like that. And that's just like an old plastic toy and some sort of like card and then some Photoshop decals over the top, really. You can see all that, yeah? Yeah,
it's fantastic. Yeah, we can see
cool.
that.
And these are some of the kind of pareidolia sketches that we've talked about before, where I've just used a kind of a highlighter pen to create some squiggles and shapes where I was looking for a kind of a shape for a character design. And from there, I've kind of like taken it into clay and sculpted it, not particularly high def or anything like that, just a rough version of it, and added bits of card and stuff like that. And again, it's just like trying to use a number of different techniques to reach a goal as quickly as I can. You can see sort of like more corporate stuff I used to do back in the day when I was working for Virgin Atlantic, where I'd mix and match doing 3D design with actually making the exhibition stands in physical 3D, because you can start to see real faults. Anything that a person's going to interact with and walk around, it's worth making a 3D model, because you can really kind of like stop any problems well in advance of sort of like actually building it. The worst thing in the world is building that thing at full scale and cost thousands and thousands of pounds, and then it doesn't work. And again, back in the day, sort of like building huge models for things like the London Dungeon, the clay and card and wood, various different sort of things. Getting out onto site, I have to measure the sites where these things are going to be fitted inside eventually. So really kind of having an understanding it, and then just getting to do the kind of fun stuff, which is, you know, doing these kind of fantasy boats. This was for a centerpiece for a kind of a casino in Holland in back in sort of like the late 90s. And this was a kind of a weird one. This is for quite a few years ago. There, you can probably tell by the length of my beard, if nothing else. The model that I've got in my hands, I built just before I went on holiday, and it was a working model. If you ran your thumb along the back of it, all the cards flicked over and showed the logo of the casino. In Holland and Belgium, they call them casinos, but they're more like amusement arcades, really. But they always theme them out, and they're quite grand and everything. This company called Homerson's. Anyway, when I came back off holiday, this was in the workshop behind me. And so they just used my card model. The engineers had just used my card model to build from. So that was pretty cool. But like I said, over time, I'm doing lots and lots of stuff to do with iteration. I don't know if you cover that or any of your students cover that, but rather than just coming with the first design that you do, just really kind of battering stuff down onto the page and really kind of getting a number of ideas going. It's many different shapes. So for this, it's like looking at kind of mechs and sort of like exploratory craft for science fiction. Here for like a Western project, like a movie project, how many different types of wagons can you come up with that are going to be interesting to look at, or even just ignored because they're mundane, but you have to come up with many different variations on a theme, and trains, and sort of like looking at costume design and trying to get something gritty kind of going on, right down to sort of like very small thumbnails of scenic elements, looking at different kind of camera views. To do this kind of stuff, obviously you need to get your head around perspective drawing. Perspective drawing is not really exciting, I have to say, when you first start to learn it, but it'll solve lots and lots of problems for you once you do get your head around it. And there's loads of great YouTube videos about learning it. If you've not come across the name Scott Robertson, he's got some great videos about learning to draw in perspective, and it's the skeleton on which you can hang this kind of concept work. I liken it to playing pool. When you first start to play pool, you have to stretch out with your arm with the pool cue and measure out the angles before you take your shot. But eventually you get to be able to just do that by eye. You can actually see where you would have put the cue, and you can get the shot right. And learning perspective, you kind of have to do the line work first, but eventually you'll be able to do that in your head, and you can just sketch straight down with, you know, decent perspective and stuff like that. So here you can see more complex ones. I'm working it all out, and the lines are actually in the drawings on some of these. But you can eventually do things like this. There's a great technique that I actually used for this one, because sometimes if you're doing a perspective drawing that's quite complicated, you can get really messy with dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of lines. So on my drawing board, all I did was I fashioned 2 pieces of blue tack, one at either side of the drawing, which was about A2, I suppose. And then I got a piece of elastic and I pinned it into the blue tack at either side, leaving a strand across the middle. And I put a paper clip on that. And once your horizon line's set with that piece of elastic, you can literally pull that up and down and draw to where those lines are. And it'll constantly remain in that 2-point perspective. There's some great videos out there. If you look at perspective drawing with paperclip and elastic, it'll bring up a dozen different sort of like videos of that, of how to do it. And it keeps you drawing clean while you can get all the main stuff right in terms of perspective drawing. So that's quite useful. And then, like I said, various different sort of like comic book art, mostly sort of like this was all hand done in pen and ink and then digitally grey toned. Again, more iterative drawings, sort of like costume design. This was part of an animation that I worked on. There's, again, great ways to get yourself out there is competitions. Every year, the London Sci-Fi Film Group run a 48-hour film competition where on a Friday you get given a line of dialogue, a prop that you have to use, and a kind of a theme, an overall theme. And we've entered it for like 6 years in a row, me and some friends, dotted all around the country, not all in the same city. And then the other year we went, right, okay, why don't we just make it really easy on ourselves and try and do it as an animation this year? Which of course isn't the easiest option, but we did a lot of the concept art in advance of it, and planning the sort of thing we wanted to do. And I was doing a lot of the background art and kind of concept art for this animation. Designed loads of props, different types of spaceship, planning sort of like how the doors would open and everything like that. And there's various little bits of video on sort of like how that would work. You can see all the sketches there. My friend Damien was doing a lot of the character designs and things like that. And I was having to make sure all my stuff fitted with his design. And what we eventually did was even some sort of graphic design stuff and logo design in there. But we submitted it and it got accepted, and we managed to get a commendation on it that year, which is the first year we'd ever had a commendation. And it's eventually, through taking it around to, and this was all, like I said, basically generated over a week pre-prep and then 48 hours actually doing the animation. We took it to a couple of different film festivals, showed it there, and it's been picked up by Dust on Amazon that show science fiction short film. And I got a check through the post the other day because it's been shown by Dust on Amazon. So I totally wasn't expecting, because I not only did this, I did some of the music for it as well, which was great fun to sort of like dabble with. This stuff is more your kind of practice stuff. This was done at the Brain Jar on one of the evenings where they run a kind of an art class there. Observational drawing will teach you more about light and understanding form and how things group together. If you're going to draw objects, my advice is to draw multiple objects together rather than single objects. You'll learn a lot more. Get yourself to a class, get yourself to a light class if you can. You can see the drawings and stuff there and some close-ups of all that. That was done all, I did the drawing in my sketchbook and then digitally painted it on the iPad, which I just photographed the sketchbook and took that into Procreate. This is obviously a Singer Sargent painting, but again, just learning the kind of broad brush strokes, how you might kind of understand how he's painted light and stuff like that. They're called master studies. Definitely worth your time to do that. Self-portraits, your own cheapest model. It's easier to sort of like just get a mirror and do a drawing of yourself and everything like that. And you can see various other things in there, sort of like from creature design, character studies, more kind of like sort of like card art for tabletop role-playing games, and that sort of work. More kind of like character art. This one is really kind of like using that kind of atmospheric perspective and just having really lots of fun with the details and everything. The idea being this chap kind of like happily walking through this town at night and not realizing you've got all of these villains knocking around in the background. Even the guy with a crossbow up there. And in the background down there, you can see that you can't see it on this necessarily, but there's a lot of cats in the back of that image. So let's try and get that up there, get around there. Yeah, and more kind of like fantasy art and D&D sort of like stuff for tabletop role-playing games and things like that. So you can see there, again, more of that, what we call iterative design. So rather than just settling for the first design you do for a character, kind of playing through it and seeing what you can really kind of achieve, different styles of and approaches to even just things like hair. And this was a weird little project, which was at the Maritime Museum. They did some reading from literature to do with the sea. So Treasure Island, Moby Dick, that sort of thing. And they wanted some visuals to go with it. So I kind of designed these images not to be seen necessarily in one go, but with enough detail in so you could pan and scan across them. So here we've got Odysseus, Owl and the Pussycat, Moby Dick, Again, more from that. More kind of nonsense stuff, more Odysseus, sort of like monstrous stuff. And then if you'll see what I mean when I kind of run this video. So it's designed to be sort of like shot close up and then kind of pulls out, pan and scan. And then you'd have somebody talking over this, reading from one of the books or something like that. So a strange kind of audio-visual illustrative process. And that's the thing that it's really useful to sort of like kind of understand, is that there's not just doing illustrations for books or magazines. Illustrative work and drawing and painting can be used in a number of different ways, and there's lots and lots of different ways to express, you know, what you want to do, and there are projects for it out there. So there's lots of strange projects. Here's a bunch of dragon heads, sort of like trying different things here, and you can see this is the pareidolia technique that I was talking about earlier, which is just a scribble technique. And I've thrashed down a load of different ideas for shapes, and then look into the shape and see what I can see. It's a psychological morbid tendency that humans have in pattern recognition that we've built up over the years, because when we were, 10 to 100,000 years ago, if we recognized something that had symmetry in the long grass, the likelihood is it was going to kill us. So it was an evolutionary benefit, and we're able to recognize shapes and patterns in things, so that when we look at a squiggle, whether it's in the carpet or in some net curtains or in a cloud, we can often see faces or other shapes in them. And concept artists use that quite often to be able to generate multiple ideas. And the nice thing about that and this pareidolia technique is that it will generate ideas that you are not expecting as an artist or a designer. So you will be constantly surprised by what you find in there. Now, it does go hand in hand with the order, that understanding a little bit about anatomy, understanding a little bit about perspective, yeah, that's the order of skill sets that you should have. They're not necessarily the most exciting things to learn because they're rigid and they're unmoving. Perspective works in the way it works. It's a mathematical sort of like process that copies the way that our brain sees the world. And anatomy is anatomy, whether it's a dog's anatomy or a horse's anatomy or a person's anatomy. There are variations, yes, between different sized bodies and things like that. But ultimately, the bones are in the same place, the muscles are attached at the same points. So that's the order. This is the chaos, and this is the fun part. So you can throw down a bunch of shapes, look for something that's exciting in there, and then use that understanding of the way to order things to add a skull or the way eyes work, or sort of like the bone structure of a dragon and everything into there. So that's quite a useful sort of like technique. And you can use this for spaceship design, you can use it for designing creatures, you can use it for character design and costume design as well. And costume design in particular is a great one for this, because we tend to hang clothes off characters that we design in a particular way that emulates the way that we see clothes every day. If you're designing future or fantastical work, for films, TV, comics, animations, whatever, then it needs to sometimes be a little bit more exaggerated or exciting to look at. And so you need to play with shapes and stuff like that. And this pareidolia technique is really where it's at a lot of the time. A lot of people call it different things, but the scientific name for that process of seeing shapes in things where there is no shape is pareidolia. So I'll leave that to, that's that. So I can show you that technique just quickly going into Procreate. I'll just open up a quick A4 file. And you can see here that basically these are the kind of pens that I use. I'll use the Studio Pen and Technical Pen. Technical Pen is just a straightforward thin line. Studio Pen is basically the same, but it has a little bit of if you add pressure, you can get a thin to thick line sort of like thing going on. And the other one that I really just use more often than not is this flat brush. And it works the same way as a magic marker, in that if you draw one line, it's light, and then if you draw back over it, you get that darker turn. So that's quite a useful thing. So does anybody have any kind of like requests for what kind of stuff they want to see? I mean, costume, props, objects, that sort of thing, or creature design sort of thing?
Props and objects or costumes are good for the kind of thing that we're doing across different
All right,
courses.
okay. Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, one of the ways you can start with something is you can kind of like figure out a basic, you know, shape of a person. It doesn't have to be too exact. And then for me, what I'd probably do is I would just duplicate that a few times. Let me just turn that down a little bit so it's in the background. And then I'm going to use the slightly heavier brush. And then looking at sort of like just not really caring much about, you know, the kind of the shape of what's going on here. Just kind of scribbling over the top of this. And then looking for what I can see in these designs and everything. And you know, you're free to eliminate the things that you don't want. I was a little heavy-handed in there. But again, now what I can do is I can throw a little bit of softening white over the top of it all. And then go in with a hard technical pen and look for the sort of things that so just using this as a sort of like a start point for a range of different ideas. And you don't have to follow it firmly, you know, it's just that ability to start looking for shapes that you might not have necessarily come up with if somebody had said, you know, oh, this person's going to need some sort of like evening frock for this event in some sort of space opera type thing. Otherwise, all of them seem to have this wide shoulder on this one. It's just the way my hand obviously moved. And if you when you're first starting out on this, doing the ones for trying to define an actual object or thing, when you've got something specific that you're trying to design in mind, it's a little harder, to be fair. When you first start out, it might be worth looking at just having a bit of fun and doing a bunch of scribbles and seeing what you can see and seeing how many different things that you can get out of that. So that's one of those kind of techniques. And then the other one, you could obviously take that to the final thing. And each one of these you could then take and then iterate again over the top of that. But you can also go in and just put a silhouette. So doing something like, and then if you take that, keep thinking it's the rectangle tool. Copy. Just gonna paste. There's a technique called the lost line method, and essentially what that looks at is you can do something as easy as and what I'm actually doing is removing from the silhouette. So there's literally no lines joining up some of these things, but what you're going to see is you're going to see the surface detail of something rather than necessarily the form. In some cases, it might add to the form if it looks like a highlight, for example, but this is great for sort of like designing multiple different versions of a costume based around a single silhouette. It might be that you achieve a silhouette that you really like the look of very, very early on, but you haven't fully kind of comprehended the surface details. So it's a really kind of useful kind of technique to employ. And each one will start to look slightly different. For whatever it is you're trying to achieve there. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So for those kind of things, I mean, a lot of the time it's for things like vehicles and spacecraft, again, for the sort of stuff that I'm doing for sort of like various things, you can easily use this sort of thing where you'll just basically throw some shapes down, and then you'll just build into them with so this might work as some sort of little tug vehicle. you know, for sort of towing things in and out of a dock, you know, in space or something like that. And there'll be shapes that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of using. That's just your start of your design process. And that's kind of how you end up at those ones that I showed you earlier. You can see, I think I've got some examples of, you know, for various kind of like other things, creature designs, all of this stuff started in the same way. All of these guys, these are slightly more refined towards the end of the process. Robot designs done exactly the same way, just starting with a kind of like a couple of scribbles and then moving on into something else. Try and find the... And other things. There's that much stuff in my Procreate now. All of these spaceships started out in that way. So again, sort of like building up unique design shapes that just from sort of like throwing down pretty hectic sort of like scribbles and shape building sort of like processes. I think I'll probably have one. Yeah, something like this. You can see, if I was to show you the... So again, just throwing things at it. I knew this was a wheeled vehicle, so it had to have the circles in there at some point for it. So I'm just playing with just throwing quick shapes down there, maybe thinking about a rider or something like that on there, and leaving things half done until I want to come back to it. So I'm not necessarily finishing everything on that one image in one go. Maybe hybridizing between 2 or 3 of the different images. So this was a set of sort of like racing cycles for a sci-fi game. And again, you can see sort of like some of them are just more random than others. At one point, you kind of get into the point where you're going, I think I want to reuse that shape some more. But that it's all the same process really for designing all of that kind of stuff. See if there's anything else in there. There's probably a dozen others in there, but yeah, again, you can see sort of like just how rough some of those early shape language drawings are. And here, something like this, where you kind of go. So again, you can see just how rough. And you'd eventually take some of those through to a final form. That one that you can see that has just kind of completed, that became one of the ones. I present slightly more finished up versions of these to the client. So I'd tighten them up as they went along, and then show the client, and they'd get to pick, 2 or 3 images from the selection that I'd given them, and then say, yeah, we want to go with those ones, and then I'd work those up into full color images. This is obviously sped up as well, so it's just the time lapse thing. So yeah, so that's the kind of pareidolia technique, I suppose.
Well, thank you very much for showing us that, Gareth.
Hey, no worries. Like I said, it's something that you build up over time. I'm just going to try and get us back onto Zoom. Right, I think that's you back on.
Excellent.
Am I back on the screen there?
You were briefly. There you are. Yeah,
cool.
Well, I mean, thank you very much for showing us that and showing us your work. I think we've got a fine art course, a 3D design course, and a fashion course all watching you.
Right.
And I think that'll tie in with a lot of the units and the work they're doing. So it's been really absolutely fantastic.
No worries, yeah.
So thank you very much for giving up your time and talking to us. And so
no worries, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
We've got links to your sites and things so the students can find them, and hopefully some of them will see you at Comic-Con very soon, which will be brilliant. So yeah, thank you very much, and I'll message you later if that's okay. And
yeah, that's great.
Thank you. Everyone say thank you to Gareth. There you go. There they are.
Don't worry at all. Yeah. Good luck with all your project stuff. Yeah. I hope all your projects go great.
Yeah, thank you for that, Gareth.